In our previous video, we generated this code here, where we flipped a coin heads and tails. Now, my question is, how do I know this is really random? How do I know that I'm not actually going to end up with more heads or more tails? How could I prove that? Well, one way I could prove it would be to run this experiment of flipping a head and tail lots of times. And I could keep a count of how many heads I've got and how many tails I've got. And if at the end of the trials they were pretty much the same, then I would be quite confident my program was giving me a random head or tail. So that's the experiment we're going to do in this little video. We're going to test whether we really are getting about the same number of heads and the same number of tails. So let's just have a look at this. So at the moment we've generated a random number. Now we need to keep a track of how many heads and how many tails we get. So we should create two variables to do this. So we're going to go init heads, and we'll set that to 0, and init tails, and we'll also set that to 0. Now when I get a head, I'm going to need to increase the number of heads I have. So it's going to be heads equals heads plus 1. Likewise for the tails. Tails equals tails plus 1. And at the end I would print out the number of heads and I will print out the number of tails. Now at the moment this will only run once. So I need to put a loop, I need to iterate over this particular statement here. So to do that I will use a for loop. So for trials equals 0 to 100. Next trials. Now I went 0 to 100, so when I write that in code it's going to be 0 to less than 100, so it's going to run 100 times. So I should get about 50 and 50. So that's my pseudocode. Generate two values to keep track of, generate a random number. I generate the random number, that should actually be inside my for loop. Check if it's heads or tails, and then print out the numbers at the end, the totals. So let's alter our code over here. Let heads equal 0, let tails equal 0. This needs to be in a for loop. So note that I am indenting all my code. So I just selected all my code then, and I just pressed tab and it moved them all in synchronously. So for let trials equals 0, while trials is less than 100, trials plus 1. Curly braces. Right, now when I get a head, I need to go heads equals heads plus 1. And just like my pseudocode, I need to go tails equals tails plus 1. And then I will console.log heads plus heads, console.log tails plus tails. So that's my code. And now I'll just run this, save it and run it. We ran it and it should have the answer at the end. There we go, I got 49 heads and 51 tails. So if I just keep refreshing, I'm getting approximately the same. Now why isn't it exactly 50% and 50%? Well, 50% and 50%, that's the theoretical probability. But in practice, things don't always work out the way they would anticipate when we use an experiment. Now, I think I can get closer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the number of trials to 1,000. And now I get 499 and 501. So but it's also printing out these heads and tails, so that's making this really long. So I'm just going to comment out these lines. And I'll run it, and it'll actually run slightly faster. So I get 46% and 53%. I keep refreshing. I'm getting closer, so we're down to like pretty close now. But what I want to do, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn these values into percentages. So here I have a number of trials which is 1,000. So I need to divide both of these by 1,000. So divide by 1,000 and then times by 100. And now it tells me I got 48.9% and 51.1%. But what if I made this 10,000? Oh, this is annoying now. Now I have to go in here, and every time I change this number, I have to change these numbers also. So how could I get around it? If this value is going to be constantly changed, and I don't want to keep changing all of them, what could I use instead? That's right, I could use a variable. So I'm going to let max trials equal 10,000. Okay, so now I save it and I run it. And these get pretty close to 50-50 now. My experimental probability is approaching my theoretical probability when I have more trials. So why don't I increase this now? I'm going to do 1,000,000 trials. So we'll see how long this takes. So I did 1,000,000 trials. I still didn't get 50-50, but I got pretty close. Run that again, and I get pretty close again. So I'm almost exactly 50-50 now. Now let's just go for broke. Let's do 10 million trials. So I did 10 million trials, and I still didn't get 50-50, but I got pretty close. So look at that, that's really close. So I can be pretty confident that my random number generator is giving me a nice random number, and I'm getting pretty close to the theoretical probability of 50% heads and 50% tails. So that's where we're going to leave this video, but we will come back to this in our next tutorial, and we will modify it and change the scenario, but use the same principles.